Jeffrey Dahmer. Just speaking that name leaves a mark. It is a permanent scar on the face of American history. The public calls him a monster. They call him a living, breathing nightmare. But why? What drives a man made of flesh and blood to become the absolute embodiment of evil? Today, you aren't just going to retell a crime story. You are going to descend deep into his twisted mind. We are going to uncover the roots of a depravity so sick and so barbaric that it is almost impossible to believe.
To navigate the labyrinth of Dahmer's mind,
We have to confront a concept that makes your skin crawl. Necrophilia. This isn't just a kink or a deviation. It is a complete collapse of reality. It is where the line between the living and the dead gets blurred and then erased. In some cases, it starts with grief. A husband who refuses to let go of his wife. A mother clinging to her child. They keep the bodies, they care for them, they talk to them, pretending that the heart is still beating. Behavioral science links this condition to deep-seated neurological damage, or even epilepsy. In their delusion, the body might be cold, but the soul, it remains. They believe the dead are still watching, still feeling every touch. And this obsession drives them to the extreme, hiding bodies, robbing graves, stealing remains, and in the darkest cases, taking them home and sleeping with them in their own beds. Way back in 1917, an Austrian neurologist laid the groundwork for analyzing this specific brand of darkness. He split it into two distinct poles. First, restrictive necrophilia. This is the tragedy of attachment, the inability to say goodbye. The survivor refuses to accept the separation. They sleep next to the departed. They cuddle them. They desperately try to find warmth in a body that has already turned cold. Second, monstrous necrophilia. Just like the name suggests, this is the absolute peak of perversion. The offender doesn't stop at emotion. They crave possession in the worst possible way. They engage in sexual intercourse with the corpse. In their frenzy, they might even bite, tear, or mutilate the remains. History has seen these monsters step out of the shadows before. Look at the UK, the case of David Fuller. By day, he was a diligent hospital electrician, but when the lights went out, he turned the morgue into his own sick playground. For decades, he violated countless bodies in the very place meant to be their final sanctuary. Or go back to the US in the 60s. Jerry Brudos. He didn't just kill. That wasn't enough. Brudos kept parts of his victims. He turned them into grotesque trophies to satisfy his urges. And it isn't just men. 1979, Karen Greenlee, a funeral home employee in California. She stole a hearse containing a body, not for ransom money, but to have private time with the deceased. At that time, the law couldn't even comprehend a crime like this. The legal system was so unprepared that Greenlee walked away with a sentence so light, it was almost an insult. But if we are looking for the absolute peak of horror in modern criminal history, the one man who makes America shudder just by hearing his name, it is Jeffrey Dahmer. Over the course of 13 years, from 1978 to 1991, he hunted down and stole the lives of 17 innocent men. At the height of his madness, the demon inside him was so hungry that a new victim was vanishing every single week. But what makes this case a historical nightmare isn't just the body count, it is the method. It was a closed loop of brutality. He drugged them, he raped them, and he murdered them. But death wasn't an escape. Dahmer continued to perform acts of necrophilia on their cold bodies. Then he dismembered them, And finally, crossing every moral boundary known to mankind, he committed the ultimate taboo. He ate them.
To decode this monster, we have to turn back the clock. May 21st, 1960. Jeffrey Dahmer enters the world in Milwaukee, born to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. The early years looked peaceful on the surface, but it was an artificial peace. The cracks appeared early. It started with the birth of his younger brother, 6 years later. Combined with the physical trauma of painful childhood surgeries, the child began to withdraw. He became insecure, and a petty, bitter jealousy began to take root in his heart. Then came the move. His father, a dedicated chemist, uprooted the family and moved them to Ohio for his career. In this strange new place, Dahmer was utterly isolated. During the most critical years of his development, he didn't have a single friend. While his parents were distracted by work and their own constant screaming matches, they unintentionally left their son alone in an inner world that was slowly rotting away. That neglect, it was the open door the darkness needed to swallow him whole. According to Dahmer himself, age 14 was the turning point. That was when the sick fantasies began to invade his young brain. He wasn't thinking about first loves or high school crushes. He was fantasizing about murder and sleeping with corpses. The final collapse came with his parents' bitter divorce. This psychological shock acted as the final catalyst. It poured gasoline on the fire of madness that had been smoldering for years. It shattered the thin wall between fantasy and reality, and it turned a lonely little boy into the most brutal nightmare in American legal history. June 1978. Fresh out of high school, Dahmer didn't waste any time. He began to turn his darkest fantasies into a terrifying reality. Stephen Mark Hicks, a young man who made one fatal mistake. He got into the wrong car. Fate brought them together hitchhiking. Dahmer lured Hicks back to his parents' house in Ohio, which was conveniently empty. Inside, alcohol flowed. Tension built. But the real nightmare started the moment Hicks tried to leave. That simple action triggered Dahmer's deepest, most primal fear. Abandonment. It snapped something inside him. He turned into a wild animal. In a drunken rage, he grabbed a heavy steel barbell and smashed it into Hicks's skull. But he didn't stop there. He strangled the boy until the very last breath left his body. To cover his tracks, Dahmer coldly dismembered the corpse. He stuffed the remains into plastic trash bags and buried them in the shallow dirt of the backyard. After his first kill, Dahmer spiraled. He drowned his guilt in alcohol and flunked out of Ohio State University almost immediately. January 1979. In a desperate attempt to straighten out his son, Dahmer's father forced him to enlist in the army. He was shipped off to Germany. But the military can't fix a broken soul. Just 2 years later, he was discharged. His alcoholism was incurable. When he returned to Ohio, he didn't come back to repent. The first thing he did? He went to the backyard. He dug up Hicks' decomposing remains. He took a sledgehammer and crushed the bones into dust. Then he scattered them deep in the woods, erasing the only evidence of his first sin. October 1981. The law started closing in on him. He was arrested for drunkenness and disorderly conduct. Lionel Dahmer, angry, helpless, and at his wits' end, made a desperate decision. He shipped Jeffrey off to live with his grandmother in Wisconsin. He hoped that a strict environment and the love of his grandmother would straighten out his broken son. But he was dead wrong. You can't cure a rotting soul just by changing the zip code. The all-night drinking binges continued. Strange men were sneaking in and out of the house in the dead of night. Dahmer's debauched lifestyle was way too much for an elderly woman to handle. For a few years, things seemed to simmer down, but it was just the calm before the storm. Because in September 1986, the perversion didn't just return, it exploded. He was caught red-handed, masturbating brazenly in front of two men. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The real crime was far darker. He had lured a boy, a child of only 13 years old, into his trap in Milwaukee. He drugged him, and he assaulted him. Standing before the judge, Dahmer offered a cold, calculated defense. He blamed the victim. He claimed the boy looked older than he was. He swore he thought the child was 18. Of course, the court didn't buy his lies. But the sentence? It was shockingly light. 1 year of work release and 5 years of probation. After his release, he went back to his grandmother's house. He wore the mask of a reformed man perfectly. He was quiet. He was docile. He kept his head down. But don't be fooled. That silence? It was just the dead calm before the storm. The second Jeffrey Dahmer moved out, the second he was alone, with no one watching over his shoulder, the gates of hell didn't just open, they were ripped off the hinges. The true nightmare was about to begin. September 1987. The pause was over. The nightmare returned. Victim number 2, Stephen Walter Tuomi. They met at a gay bar. They ended up at the Ambassador Hotel. They drank until the world went black. But the next morning, only Dahmer woke up. He had no memory of the night before, a total blackout. All he saw was Tuomi, lying there, motionless. No breath in his lungs. Blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Instead of panicking, instead of calling 911, Dahmer was terrifyingly calm. He went out and bought a large suitcase. He folded the body inside, and he took it straight to his grandmother's house. Think about that. In that dark, damp basement, right beneath the floorboards where his family walked and slept, he committed the vilest acts imaginable. He had sex with the cold body. Then, he dismembered it, cutting off the limbs, and threw the rest out with the weekly trash. With this murder, the amateur was gone. Dahmer's predatory skills were evolving. He was becoming efficient. Gay clubs, shopping malls, lonely bus stops at midnight. These weren't just public places anymore. They were his personal hunting grounds. The bait was simple, but deadly effective. A sweet compliment, a promise of quick cash, or the offer of a fun night out. Once the trap snapped shut, once they walked through his front door, their fate was sealed. He spiked their drinks with a cocktail of powerful sleeping pills. He watched them drift into unconsciousness. And then, he coldly squeezed the life out of them. Then came the ritual we know too well, the violation of the corpse, the systematic destruction of the body piece by piece to make it disappear. But the true horror? That was in his collection. Dahmer didn't just kill. He kept souvenirs. Trophies of the dead. Preserved genitals. And even more terrifying, skulls, bleached and cleaned. hidden away in his closet. And he documented it all. With a Polaroid camera, he snapped photos of every stage of the slaughter. The bodies, the dismemberment. Why? Because he wanted to freeze those moments in time. He wanted to look at them later, to relive that rush of absolute power whenever the urge struck him again. May 14, 1990. A new address was carved into the history of true crime. Apartment 213, the Oxford Apartments, Milwaukee. This was the slaughterhouse where the monster, Jeffrey Dahmer, finally unleashed his full brutality. From the moment he signed the lease, the violence didn't just continue, it escalated out of control. In just 15 short months, this tiny room witnessed the permanent end of 12 men. Late 1990. 4 lives taken. February and April 1991. 2 more vanished without a trace. May 1991. Another one never came home. But the peak of the insanity? That hit in the summer of 1991. From May to July, Dahmer was killing like a relentless machine. He was claiming a life, on average, every single week. The list of the dead stretched on, with no regard for race or background. 3 black men, 1 white man, 1 Laotian, 1 Hispanic. They all met the same dark fate inside those walls. And it is important to note, not every victim was gay. Some of them were simply people who trusted the wrong man at the wrong time. The most heartbreaking tragedy, however, belongs to the youngest. Conorak Synthasamphone and James Edward Dockstader. Both were only 14 years old. They died before their lives had even really started. Even the oldest victim in this spree, Raymond Lamont Smith, was just 32. Apartment 213 wasn't just an apartment. It had transformed into a mass grave, a burial ground for stolen dreams. Amidst this relentless killing spree, there is one specific case that stands as the single greatest stain on the history of the Milwaukee Police Department. The case of the Laotian boy, Conorak Synthasamphone. It was a night in May 1991. Conorak was just 14 years old when he walked into Dahmer's trap. Dahmer drugged him, dragged him back to that apartment reeking of death, and subjected him to a vile sexual assault. But around 2 a.m., a miracle happened. Conorak woke up. Through the haze of drugs, he realized the blonde man was looming over him. A primal survival instinct took over, stronger than the sedatives. Conorak fought his way up. In his sheer panic, he didn't even realize he was completely naked. He only knew one thing: he had to run. Seizing a split second of distraction, Conorak bolted out of that door to hell. He ran blindly into the main street. His mind was spinning from the sedatives. His vision was blurring. But his legs? They wouldn't stop moving. Run. Just run. As far away as possible. And for a moment, it seemed like luck was finally on his side. He stumbled upon 2 women in the dead of night. They were shocked. Before them stood a naked child, dazed, bleeding. One of them grabbed a phone and dialed 911 immediately. "There is a boy here who needs urgent help. He is naked, he is hurt, and he is terrified." Police and paramedics arrived on the scene quickly. Standing before them was a teenager with glazed, vacant eyes. The pure horror of what he had just endured was still stamped across his young face. By all logic, Conorak should have been saved that night. Paramedics quickly wrapped a blanket around the boy's trembling shoulders. He was stumbling, His eyes were rolling back. The heavy dose of sedatives was soaking into every cell of his body. The officers were confused. They were looking at an Asian teenager who couldn't form a coherent sentence. Between the language barrier and his delirious state, he was completely helpless. At the scene, the two witnesses, Sandra Smith and Nicole, stood their ground. They were trying to protect the victim. But then, a shadow emerged from the darkness. A white male, tall, blonde. He walked up calmly and stood right next to Konarak. It was none other than Jeffrey Dahmer. Instead of running, he chose a bold frontal confrontation. He put on a perfect performance. He spoke to the officers with a chillingly calm voice. "This is my partner. He's 19 years old. He's just drunk."
We had a little lover's spat. To sell the lie, he even voluntarily handed over his ID for the officers to check. His confidence was absolute. As for Konarak, the drugs and the sheer terror had locked his jaw shut. He wanted to scream. He wanted to beg. But he couldn't force a single word out of his mouth. The two young women couldn't believe what they were hearing. They fought back. They protested screamingly. "No way! The boy was struggling to get away from him. He's naked and he's panicked. That is not being drunk." They tried everything to flag down the obvious red flags waving right in front of the officers' faces. But tragically, the desperate warnings of these two young women were brushed aside. Prejudice clouded the judgment of the law enforcement officers that night. They chose to believe the polite, calm white man over two concerned black women. To verify the story, the two officers made the fatal decision to escort them both back to apartment 213. They were walking him right back into the devil's lair. Dahmer's apartment was strangely tidy, but hanging heavy in the air was a putrid, overpowering stench. The smell of death. A smell he casually explained away with a simple lie. "My refrigerator is broken." On the sofa, Konarak's clothes were folded neatly. To seal the deal, Dahmer even pulled out the Polaroid photos. Pictures of the boy in compromising positions, offered as proof of the romantic relationship he had invented. The performance was flawless. Konarak sat there, on that fatal sofa. He was like a living corpse. The drugs had completely paralyzed his nervous system. He couldn't speak. He couldn't fight back. He just sat there, staring blankly into the void. And Dahmer? He kept playing the role of the apologetic boyfriend to perfection. He apologized to the officers for the hassle. He promised to take good care of his boyfriend. His cold, calculated composure fooled every single one of them. In the eyes of the police that night, this was nothing more than a lover's quarrel. A gay domestic dispute. A messy civil matter they just wanted to wash their hands of. Despite Sandra Smith and her cousin screaming their objections one final time, the door to apartment 213 closed in their faces. The officers walked away, content that they had handled the situation. They had no idea that they had just physically handed an innocent 14-year-old boy back to a monster. And in doing so, they signed his death warrant that very night. Fatal negligence. The two officers walked away, never once setting foot in the bedroom. If they had just opened that one door, they would have been staring at the decomposing body of Tony Hughes, a previous victim, still lying right there on the bed. Even worse, that room was a private museum of death. Polaroids of mutilated corpses, bleached human skulls, arranged neatly on the shelf like trophies. It was all hiding in plain sight, just a few feet away.
but it was all mist. The second the police footsteps faded down the hall, Dahmer's polite mask shattered. He turned back to Conorak. He wrapped his massive hands around the boy's throat. He squeezed, and he kept squeezing, until that small chest stopped rising forever. And then, the ritual continued. He performed sexual acts on the still, lifeless body, finally satisfying the sick, twisted hunger that drove him. The irony is sickening. That calm, cooperative man, the one who politely handed his ID to the officers, he was a cannibalistic monster. If only. Just one standard police procedure, that's all it would have taken. Run the ID. If they had just run a background check on that ID card he handed them, Jeffrey Dahmer's thick file as a registered sex offender would have flashed across their screens, and Conorak's synthesome phone would be alive today. But in the cold reality of that night, there are no what-ifs. But the tragedy isn't just about the killer. It is about the apathy of the system. Because just on the other side of that wall, there was a woman who refused to give up. Glenda Cleveland. She was 36 years old. She lived right next door. And she was the mother of one of the girls who tried to save Conorak. Her gut told her something was violently wrong. She called the police station. She demanded to know the condition of the Asian boy. She questioned his age. But the answer she got was cold and final. He is an adult. Drop it. A few days later, her worst fears were confirmed. The newspapers ran a story about a missing Laotian boy. Conorak synthesome phone. She looked at the photo. That face. Those eyes. It was him. The naked, bleeding boy who tried to run. Glenda called the police immediately. She told them about the match. She connected the dots for them. But instead of listening, the officer on duty was visibly annoyed. He brushed her off. "Ma'am, I don't have to explain myself to you. It is a private matter between two men. We do not interfere in their domestic lifestyle." A blatant, sickening refusal of responsibility. But Glenda wouldn't accept it. 2 days later, she picked up the phone again, hoping to find just one officer with a conscience. But the only response to her persistence was the sound of the line going dead. They hung up on her. In desperation, she even tried to contact the FBI office in Milwaukee. Dead end. The desperate cries of a good citizen were drowned out by the bureaucracy and negligence of a broken system. 2 months passed in deadly silence. But on the night of July 22nd, 1991, fate finally came knocking for Jeffrey Dahmer. A Milwaukee police patrol was cruising near the University District. Suddenly, they spotted a figure sprinting through the darkness, running for his life. And dangling from one of his wrists was a pair of handcuffs. At first glance, the officers assumed he was a criminal on the run, a fugitive. But the man, Tracy Edwards, told them a story that stopped them cold. He had just barely escaped from a blonde man, a man who had held him captive, threatened him, and assaulted him. Now, the story involved a gay encounter. In 1991, that was usually a signal for police to back off. They often dismissed these cases as civil disputes or lovers' quarrels. But this time, something told them they couldn't just walk away. They made the decision to take Edwards back to the scene to confront his attacker. The Oxford Apartments, 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213. A knock on the door. It swings open. Standing there is a blond man, roughly 30 years old. His face is calm, but his eyes, they're shifting, evasive. The officers sense something is off. They decide to push past him into the bedroom. And that is where the truth was finally exposed. An officer reaches for the nightstand. He pulls open the drawer. He isn't looking for a gun. He isn't looking for drugs. What he finds freezes his blood. Polaroids. Graphic, color photos documenting the unthinkable. Dismemberment. Evisceration. Human bodies treated like toys. Stored right there next to where he slept. No hesitation. The cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut on Dahmer's wrists. But the real chaos was just starting. As one officer moved toward the refrigerator, Dahmer snapped. The man who was being restrained suddenly fought like a wild animal. He lunged at the police. He was desperate. He had to keep that door closed at all costs. But it was too late. The officer pulled the handle. He looked inside. And he slammed it shut instantly, a reflex of pure terror. He turned to his partner, his voice trembling in shock. "There is a human head in there." Backup swarmed the scene. Forensics. The first thing that hit them was the smell. The overwhelming stench of old blood and rotting flesh filled every corner. Apartment 213 was no longer a home. It was a crypt. In the main fridge, a decomposing head. In the freezer, 3 more heads. Wrapped in plastic bags, stocked like groceries. The bathroom door was reinforced with a heavy-duty steel latch. It wasn't just a bathroom. It had been turned into a sealed prison cell. A reporter standing at the scene wrote down what she saw with trembling hands. Her notebook became a bloody indictment of hell on earth. In the corner of the room, a pressure cooker. Inside, human hands and male genitalia in the process of decomposing. On the boiler shelf, 2 bare skulls were on display, surrounded by a chemist's nightmare: alcohol, chloroform, and formaldehyde, the fluid used to embalm the dead. Glass jars holding preserved body parts, kept like science experiments. But the absolute peak of the horror? The gallery. The Polaroid collection documenting Dahmer's sick, twisted joy. A human head lying casually in the kitchen sink. A body sliced open from neck to groin, a cut so clean, so professional, it exposed the pelvic bone inside. And the victims. Poor souls forced to pose in humiliating positions of slavery, moments before they were slaughtered. Forensic experts began a grueling race against the dead. They analyzed every scrap of DNA from the fragmented remains. They cross-referenced them with the heartbreaking list of missing young men, and even used samples from Dahmer's own family to find matches. When the results were released, the world went into shock. All eyes turned to apartment 213. It was no longer just a crime scene. It was branded a slaughterhouse in the heart of the city. The true face of Jeffrey Dahmer was finally revealed. Grotesque, terrifying, crossing every boundary of human morality. But here is the paradox. This monster? He was the son of a respected PhD chemist. He came from an intellectual, upstanding family. So, what was the motive? That question became an obsession for all of American society at the time. From the headlines, to the reporters, to the average citizen on the street, everyone was asking the same thing. Everyone was desperate for the answer. What was it that broke the mind of a quiet, gentle child? What turned him into a bloodthirsty demon? Investigators and psychologists threw around countless theories, but as the fog began to lift, the darkest secrets were finally dragged into the light. The man who held the key to unlock Dahmer's dark mind was Detective Patrick Kennedy. A large man with a thick, heavy beard. He was the only one Dahmer trusted enough to open up to recount every detail of his 13-year bloodbath. In the natural world, eating your own kind is a survival instinct. But for Dahmer, it was a choice. He confessed everything to Kennedy. It didn't stop at dismemberment. It didn't stop at necrophilia. He crossed the final line of humanity. He ate his victims. It was a twisted, chilling logic. He believed that by consuming their flesh, the victims would live on. They would become a permanent part of him, and they would never, ever leave him. So, what created this monster? How can a human being slide so deep into the pit of madness and animalistic violence? Experts have weighed many theories. Was it a turbulent childhood?
The emotionally distant parenting? Was it the brain injuries he suffered as a kid? Or was it the result of chronic alcohol and drug abuse, rotting his brain from the inside out? In his hauntingly painful memoir, A Father's Story, Lionel Dahmer opened his heart about the tragedy of his life. He insisted on one thing. He and his wife never stopped trying to give their son the best upbringing possible. But there is an invisible fear that haunts every parent. It is the moment a child builds a wall around themselves, totally isolating themselves from the family. It is like a dark whirlpool. Slowly, but relentlessly, it pulls the child out of their parents' protective arms and into the void. Lionel didn't run from the blame. He stared directly at the cracks in his own home. He admitted that no family is perfect. Dahmer's mother, Joyce? She was a woman consumed by illness, battling constant physical and mental pain. And Lionel, the dedicated PhD chemist? He chose to bury himself in his work. He hid behind test tubes and chemicals, just to escape the suffocating atmosphere of his own house. The result was inevitable. Coldness, distance, and finally, a bitter divorce. Right when Dahmer was at his most vulnerable age. However, Lionel emphasized one crucial point. Yes, the family trauma was real, but it is not the master key to this crime. A broken home is not enough to turn a human being into a monster, stripped of all humanity. He believes that something else, some darker force, hijacked his son's soul. Many criminologists agree on one thing. The move to Ohio? That was the final nail in the coffin. In this new place, he was totally lost. The social isolation pushed him deeper and deeper, retreating into his own dark inner world. Between the ages of 10 and 15, the red flags were blazing. Lionel remembers it with pain. While other kids were out playing sports, Dahmer was finding joy in trash bags. He was collecting roadkill, building a miniature cemetery in the backyard. But he wasn't just burying them. He was skinning them. Even worse, he once mounted a dog's head on a stake, planting it in the ground like some savage, ancient ritual. The contrast within the family made the sickness even more obvious. His brother was studying, building a career,
starting a family. But Dahmer? His life was a flat line. No goals, no ambition. He was living by his own moral code, a place where right and wrong were inverted. Inside that brain, only one thing played on a loop: slow-motion scenes of death, visions of dismemberment. It was the incubation period of a mind that was completely breaking. And then, the nightmare spilled out into the real world. First, exhibitionism, running into the street naked. Then, child molestation. And finally, the ultimate destination: murder. Every time Dahmer got in trouble with the law, Lionel hired the best lawyers money could buy. He hoped that leniency, that a second chance, would wake his son up. But it was a false hope. He finally realized his little boy was gone forever. The thing he was trying to protect wasn't human anymore. It was an uncontrollable killing machine. Professor James Allen Fox, the Dean of Criminal Psychology at Northeastern University in Boston. He had to admit a bitter truth. Science was blind here. There were no early warning signs clear enough to stop a tragedy of this magnitude. Behavioral science was seemingly powerless against the anomaly that was Jeffrey Dahmer. People often point to the moment his mother left him. They see it as the final push that shattered his psyche. But it would be a cruel injustice to dump all the responsibility on his parents, or even on the negligence of the police. The sin belongs to the sinner. The blame belongs to the executioner. And that name is Jeffrey Dahmer. Professor Fox concluded that Dahmer was a freak variable in the history of criminology. He wasn't just a killer. He was a slave to his own unstoppable, depraved fantasies. But the most chilling difference? It lies in the boundary of satisfaction. For the vast majority of serial killers, when the victim takes their last breath, the game is over. But for Dahmer, the death of the victim was not the end. On the contrary, it was just the prelude, the opening act for the real, sick feast that followed. January 13, 1992. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer officially began, and Milwaukee had never witnessed a spectacle like this. The courthouse was transformed into an impenetrable fortress. Security was suffocating. Bomb-sniffing dogs swept every single corner. Anyone wanting to pass through the doors of justice, whether press or public, had to navigate a gauntlet of strict metal detectors. Inside the courtroom, Dahmer was in total isolation. He sat behind a wall of bulletproof glass and cold steel bars, like a wild beast that needed to be caged away from the civilized world. 100 seats, not a single one empty. 23 reporters, 43 curious spectators, and the most heartbreaking group of all, 34 family members of the victims. They sat there, face to face with the man who had ripped their loved ones away. The key players in this legal drama took their places: Judge Lawrence Graham, Prosecutor Michael McCann, and defense attorney Gerald Boyle. Even Lionel Dahmer, the tormented father, was present for every agonizing moment. At first, Dahmer planned to deny everything, but under his lawyer's advice, he changed his strategy. He admitted to every single act, but with one crucial condition. He claimed insanity. This was attorney Gerald Boyle's all-in gamble. He wasn't trying to prove Dahmer was innocent. How could he? The body parts in the fridge were undeniable proof. Instead, Boyle wanted to prove his client was legally incompetent. He argued that Dahmer was a sick, pitiable patient, rather than a villain to be blamed. To back this up, the defense called 45 witnesses. They painted a picture of deep deviance, sexual disorders, and his obsession with necrophilia. They portrayed a man completely detached from reality, a man who viewed murder as a hunting game within his own delusional world. But prosecutor Michael McCann had a different view, a colder, harder look at the facts. He insisted Dahmer was not insane. He knew exactly what he was doing was wrong. He knew it was evil, but he chose to do it anyway. That isn't pathology. That is pure cruelty. Dahmer was the embodiment of a bloodthirsty demon, a calculated killing machine. And so, the biggest question was placed before the jury. Jeffrey Dahmer. Was he truly a mental patient in need of treatment? Or was he a monster that needed to be permanently removed from society? The tension in the courtroom reached a fever pitch. The jury was forced into a secret ballot. At first, the defense attorney's arguments for insanity seemed to be working. It looked like the scales of justice might actually tip in Dahmer's favor. But prosecutor Michael McCann was a warrior, and he refused to accept defeat. He stood firm on one absolute truth. Jeffrey Dahmer was completely sane. He was in control of every action. And the defense playing out in court? It was nothing but a lie. McCann dropped the hammer with ironclad evidence. This was not a naive or confused man. He had attacked his own squad mates in the Army. He had preyed on students at Ohio State University. It was all part of a calculated, methodical roadmap of violence. McCann posed the fatal question: how could a crazy person, a man who has lost his mind, design a murder script so perfect, so tight, and so detailed? To drive the final nail into the coffin of the defense, 2 officers took turns reading the official record. Every word echoed like a hammer strike. The document laid bare the naked depravity, the sick, twisted pleasures of the flesh. And most importantly, it contained the cold confession of Dahmer himself. I believe that what I did was intentional. Everything was completely under my control. However, Attorney Boyle did not back down. He used a haunting metaphor to drill into the minds of the jury. The broken wheel. He drew a wheel. Dahmer was the hub in the center, but every single spoke around him was shattered. That, he argued, was why he was lost. Boyle listed a catalog of horrors, acts that do not belong in the human world, to prove his client was insane. Keeping human heads in the refrigerator, drilling holes into victims' skulls with the delusion of turning them into obedient zombies. Necrophilia. Cannibalism. Building a shrine to death in his own bedroom. That is not the crime of a sane man. That is the portrait of a severe schizophrenic. In response, Michael McCann stood up. His voice was like steel. Ladies and gentlemen, do not be fooled. He argued that Dahmer was a predator in a human suit. Before he struck, he used the sweetest, most charming words to lure his prey into the trap. That kind of cunning does not come from a broken brain. The fiery debate finally reached one single point of agreement. Both sides admitted that Jeffrey Dahmer was deeply psychologically disturbed. But the life or death question remained. Was he sane enough to answer to the law? July 13, 1992. A sudden, shocking twist in the courtroom. Jeffrey Dahmer waived his defense. He bowed his head and accepted the full weight of his guilt. The judge spent 5 tense hours deliberating the final verdict. The result? No mercy. No mental hospital. His future belonged to the cold, hard walls of a prison cell. Dahmer was handed 15 consecutive life sentences, a total of 957 years behind bars. He was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. During his time serving his sentence, Dahmer appeared to be a model prisoner. He was compliant. He followed the rules. But inside the dark underworld of the prison population, he was a pariah. He was rejected, isolated, bullied, and frequently beaten by other inmates. The warning shot came on July 13, 1994. He was attacked by a Cuban inmate right in the middle of a prayer service. And it was this specific event that led Dahmer to make a fatal request. He asked to be integrated. He wanted to eat and work with the other inmates. He wanted to escape the crushing solitude. But ironically, out of thousands of inmates, fate decided to group Dahmer on a work detail with 2 of the most dangerous men in the facility. Jesse Anderson, a white man who had brutally murdered his wife and then tried to pin the crime on black men. And Christopher Scarver, a black man suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, a man who called himself the Son of God and believed he had the divine right to judge and kill. This was a recipe for disaster, a death cocktail. Scarver harbored a deep, burning hatred for white racists. And remember, the majority of Dahmer's victims were people of color. And what was bound to happen finally happened. The morning of November 28, 1994, the guards made a critical error. They left these 3 dangerous men unsupervised in the restroom area for just 20 minutes. That short window was all Scarver needed to execute his own verdict. When the guards returned, they walked into a bloodbath. Dahmer and Anderson were lying motionless on the floor. Jeffrey Dahmer's head had been crushed, deformed beyond recognition. Nearby lay Anderson, battered and broken. Standing amidst the carnage was Christopher Scarver. Gripped tightly in his hand was a metal broom handle, dripping with blood. 9:11 a.m. Jeffrey Dahmer took his last breath. The life of one of history's most horrific serial killers had officially ended. Christopher Scarver, already serving life, was handed another life sentence and shipped off to federal prison. 13 years of terror. 17 innocent lives stolen. In the end, all Dahmer left behind was a belated apology that dissolved into nothingness. The final headlines printed in the press read like a haunting last testament from Jeffrey Dahmer. It was his final message before he faced his execution inside those prison walls. It is all over. I never dared to dream of freedom, and deep down, I didn't even want it. He confessed with brutal honesty. I look forward to death. It is the only escape. I don't hate anyone. I know what I am. I am a monster. I am a madman. Or maybe I am both. And in those final moments, the man who once played God with life and death reached out to religion as his final lifeline. Thank God that I will never be able to harm another living soul. Only He can save me now. After the brutal death of his son in 1994, Lionel Dahmer, a father broken by tragedy, published his memoir, A Father's Story. He pledged every cent of the profits to the families of the victims. It was a belated act of atonement, a desperate apology on behalf of the son who had caused so much pain. But make no mistake, this book was not an excuse. It was the raw, agonizing cry of a helpless father, forced to watch his own flesh and blood slide uncontrollably into the darkness. Readers described the writing as heartbreakingly honest, real enough to make you wince. It forces us to confront the thin, fragile line between fatherly love and absolute madness. It compels us to question, how much responsibility does a family truly hold in shaping a human soul? As for Dahmer's personal belongings, everything was awarded to the families of 11 victims as compensation. A hollow gesture, because no amount of money could ever fill the void of their loss. Jeffrey Dahmer. The name remains a permanent scar on American history. His story has been retold in movies, dissected in thousands of documents, serving as a terrifying reminder of one simple truth. Monsters don't always crawl out of hell. Sometimes, they live right among us, wearing a human mask. The file on Jeffrey Dahmer is now closed. As we close the file on Jeffrey Dahmer, we are forced to look beyond the cold walls of the prison. We must face a painful, burning issue in our own society. How? How does a shy, timid little boy transform into such a horrific nightmare? Raising a child is never a simple equation. Human psychology shifts and changes faster than we can imagine. Every child is born like a sheet of paper, pure, white, blank, and life writes upon it, using the ink of family, of education, and of the environment they breathe. If that paper is watered with love and responsibility, the child grows into a kind human being. But if they are abandoned in trauma, if they are forced to breathe a toxic atmosphere, then anger, selfishness, and cruelty will take root. Personality is not just born. It is the sum of thousands of scars and thousands of choices made over time. So let's ask one final hypothetical question. If Jeffrey Dahmer had grown up in a truly happy home, would this bloodbath have ever happened? What if his mother hadn't walked out? What if his father had put down the test tubes? If he had stopped running from the family conflicts, stopped hiding in his work, and actually looked his son in the eye? Especially during that critical move to Ohio, when Dahmer's soul was already crisscrossed with scars from surgeries and from years of cold neglect. If only, right then, he had received real care, real understanding from the people who gave him life. Would that sick, twisted monster have ever been unleashed to terrorize the world? That is a haunting what if, and it is one that will never have an answer. The dark chapter of Jeffrey Dahmer ends here. Thank you for your patience and for walking this journey into the darkness with me. If this story left you with something to think about, please hit like, share it with others, and most importantly, smash that subscribe button. Give me the motivation to crack open the next criminal file. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next case.